What's up, everyone? Normal Christians Podcast. My name is Bo. As always, I reserve the right to get smarter. And today, I'm going to talk about a little money, money, money. Isn't that the song? I don't even know if that's the song. I'm sorry. You tuned in expecting to hear something, anything besides me singing, but then you just get me singing. What is that song? I don't know. I should have looked it up before I started the podcast, so that's my fault. But I think it goes, money, 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 something like that. So if you didn't figure this out, I'm actually a terrible singer, so that's my bad. But anyway, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about some money. And really spurred my mind on about this topic when I came across a little bit of an older article now from Christianity Today, and the title was "Who Are the Most Generous? Not who you'd expect." And then the subtitle was "The Secret to Becoming a Cheerful Giver is to Remember Whom We Are Giving to." And so while it was a good article, really it was just the statistics that jumped out to me on it. And this is what they ended up saying, just in general about people giving. 84% of millennials report to giving less than $50 to charity per year, even though charitable giving ranks high on their priorities. The most generous generations in the $500 to $2,500 range is Gen X. And the most generous generation over $2,500 is comprised of those older than baby boomers. It would be easy to blame our materially obsessed culture, but Christians fare no better when it comes to giving. So anyway, that right there just kind of gives you an idea of giving in general isn't that great. People put giving, or I should say, put charities and charitable giving high on their priority list, but we don't seem to be giving that much to it. Millennials kind of bring up the back end of that, and it looks like more of the bigger gifts come from older people. Nothing out of the ordinary right now. But then when it gets to Christian giving, it says, according to nonprofit source, only 5% of church members give regularly. Households that make up more than $75,000 annually are the least charitable. Nationwide, Christians today give 2.5% of their income. For comparison, during the Great Depression, that number was 3.3%. I mean, think about that. That's a staggering statistic, at least when this was written. Christians today give about 2.5% of their income. During the Great Depression, that number was 3.3%. It's crazy to think about. Continuing on, 37% of those who consider themselves evangelicals do not give to the church at all. According to a study from the University of Notre Dame, cited by Christian Smith and Hilary Davidson in their book, The Paradox of Generosity, when it comes to giving away 10% of finances, only 2.7% of people, religious or non-religious, fall into this category. Other studies confirm this dismal picture, as the long-term study by John L. and Sylvia somebody wrote in their book, The State of the Church Giving through 2007. So that last part right there just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of that kind of reality where 37% of those evangelicals, just in general, 37% do not give to the church at all in any sort of amount. And then in the book that was quoted, when it comes to giving 10% away, which at least in Christianity is always seen as kind of your baseline giving, your tithe, which you're supposed to give, only 2.7% of people, and you could count that religious and non-religious, actually fall into that category of giving 10% away of their finances. Now, this is a little bit older. I've actually read some different things about giving through the pandemic, which has been a little bit different maybe than you'd expect. But I'm not going to get into that now because the stuff that I'm reading here is overall the trend before COVID, before the pandemic that was going on. The statistics seem to bear out this whole reality where only 5% of church members give regularly. And if anybody's been in the church for any amount of time, at least in a leader, pastor, any sort of sense in that way, you know definitely that usually a small number of people give the most, in the sense of this small group of people pretty much funds the church in a lot of ways as compared to if everybody gave that sort of amount. But it also talked about households that make more than $75,000 annually are the least charitable, which is always a surprising thing to hear, but not odd in a sense, because again, the statistics bear this out, that some of the people with the most resource, turns out they're some of the least giving. Even though they have the ability to give more, they seem to give less, if not at all. And those without, you would think without the resource or without the ability to give a lot, they actually give a lot more for the most part. And then that statistic I read that Christians today give 2.5% of their income nationwide, if we're talking about our country. And in the Great Depression, I mean, it was almost a percentage point higher. Just nuts. And so, giving's always an interesting topic, right? Anytime we talk about money, it's an interesting topic. As a matter of fact, if you're still with me, you might be getting a little bit of a cold sweats just talking about money, especially when we're talking about it in the context of church, because I don't know about you, but I've certainly had some bad experiences in the past, been in some interesting situations where churches certainly don't mind talking about money, right? That is actually a big thing culturally with churches. One of the things I've heard is the reverse ATM. Don't know if you've ever heard of that, but take an ATM, right? It's this machine that you put your card into and you get money out. That's how an ATM works. But in a lot of more contemporary churches that have these kiosks where you could pay your tithe from the kiosk, it's kind of considered the reverse ATM, where you put your card in, but instead of getting money, money's taken away from your account. So there's all kinds of cultural things to be said about money. And there are plenty of pastors and churches who clearly abuse their money, especially when we start getting into the realm of the prosperity gospel and those people who certainly, I don't know, I'm not the judge of any person's heart, but I despise the prosperity gospel and what it's about and what it's done in the cultural consciousness of Christianity and what that means. So despise it in so many ways. But all that to say, when I'm talking about money in the church, maybe some cold sweats start happening, maybe some PTSD throwback to the pastor going, yeah, we're going to pass the plates again, Oh, I feel the spirit in the place saying we need to pass the plates again. Come on, everybody, we're going to pass the plates. Good old random preacher voice there. But, some churches used to put their giving actually up on the board, or, the pastor get up, well, we can't meet this, and that, so we're going to pass the plate. That whole thing. I get it. We talk about money, we talked about church, there's a lot involved in it, but here's the reality. You can't read the Bible and come away with really any other conclusion than God does want us to be generous. Now, this isn't to go down the path that the prosperity gospel preach. We want to avoid that at all costs. But you can't overlook generosity, and it's important to the biblical story and to us as Christians. As a matter of fact, I don't care if it was the very beginning of the church in Acts, where it talks about everyone got together and they gave all that they had, or you want to talk about Paul and his journeys writing back in Corinthians to the Christians in Macedonia, I believe, in different areas, where he talks about them being extremely poor, extremely poor, yet they're generous. The church in Philippi, and when he writes in Philippians, it's about them supporting him in his journeys, even though they had some things going on. And then you get into Revelation, I believe, in the church of Laodicea, if I'm remembering this offhand correctly. They were rich, but in Christ's eyes, he considered them poor. And there's different reasons for that. But there's always a sense about generosity, that we need to be generous in our speech, generous in our time, but certainly generous in our resource. So I don't care how you come about this. If you're a Christian, giving is a part of it. Generosity is a part of it. And it's certainly in different ways beyond money. But our money and our resource does count. So why don't we give? Again, it would be hard-pressed for someone to explain to me or to show me biblically where you could base a position not on generosity. I know there's people who say that tithing isn't a part of the church anymore, and that's fine. We can have those talks later in a different sense. I'm not saying I'm for or against any of that, different podcast maybe, or a different episode. But regardless of how you get about it, generosity seems to be key. It seems to be obvious, but we're not doing it. And we're giving very, very little, especially when it seems to be when you compare it to some of these early Christians and to some of these churches that we have recorded for us and their generosity and their love. So why aren't we doing it? Well, I think a couple reasons. One I've heard before, and this is certainly a reasonable reason. There you go. Terrible terminology there. But I can see why people would have trepidation at times to give. And that's because at some places and sometimes you're worried about what are they doing with this money. And it's always a fair thing to do and to think about. I do think and hope that when we give our money, whether it be to a church or other nonprofit organizations, that we do our homework, that we look into it and hopefully see, okay, what are they doing with this money? If it's a nonprofit, how much is actually going to these people? For instance, I support a child in Haiti. And with that organization that I go through, they make it clear they give 80% of all that's given goes to the child, the situation, the family, all of that sort of stuff. And the other 20% gets divvied up in different ways. That's great. I know whenever I give X amount per month, 80% of that is going to the child that I'm supporting. So there's definitely, at times, an understandable pushback or an understandable fear of, I work hard for my money, man. You know, God's blessed me with this. I want it to be effective. I want it to be efficient. And so, what are we doing with this money, church? Or what are we doing with this money, organization? But let's really focus on the church. You know, you want to give to the church, but we've all seen churches abuse money. We've all seen churches do things not that great with their money. So I can understand saying, well, I don't know. Well, let me be smart with my money. But having clarified that, but still not an excuse not to give. As a matter of fact, I would push back on some sense of this overall feeling that if a church, let's say, does not do everything I want with my money, I shouldn't give. And I know that may seem extreme, but I've seen it before. And not only have I seen it before, in different contexts I've been in directly, I've seen the fruit of that where people say, I will give, but I want this specifically done with my money. Or I don't like this part of the church, or this part of the budget, or this part of what we're planning to do, so I'm a little afraid to give because I don't want part of my money going to that instead of this and all that sort of thing. And I would definitely push back against that in strong ways. Of course, let's be smart. Of course, let's not just throw money at people and organizations that probably aren't doing the best with it. For instance, if your pastor is driving a Maserati and everybody in the church is just, middle-class people, that should be a red flag. If the church continues to spend on lavish things when there are maybe other ways that money could be applied, that's a red flag. Maybe you don't stop giving. I worked as a part of a mega church and I saw behind the scenes and they did great things with the money. And that's not even to say the pastors were driving things like that, because they weren't. And I can only speak to my time there, but everything I saw was on the up and up. So people certainly looking from the outside would say, oh, of course, it's a mega church, they're not using their money, they should be doing more, blah, blah, blah. Everybody's got opinions, right? You'll never make anyone happy, but I know these people. They were great people. I still have the utmost respect for the leaders of that church and what they were doing. Does that mean I agreed with everything? Of course not. But my place isn't to sit there and debate with them on money. I was a part of the church. I knew the leaders. I knew their hearts. And it's to do what I'm about to say is the key here, is that we have to give and trust God. That's an important part. Too often we get caught up in our opinions of what we believe is best rather than stepping out and trusting God. Again, we're not dumb. We're not just giving to this pastor, this organization that's clearly money grubbing, that's clearly just out here living the high life off of the money and not doing what they should. But instead, you're plugged into a church, and I assume that that's your community. Well, then you need to step out in faith and trust and give to God, even though things may not be exactly how you want. That's part of the work of faith, is you step out in faith, giving, saying, God, I believe I'm supposed to be generous. And in this case, this specific instance, generous with my money, my resource. So I'm going to give this to you, God. That's what I'm doing. I'm stepping out in faith and giving it to you. Now, the avenue that goes through is the church. But God, this is my community, this is my church. I know the people. I know all this. I'm going to step out. Sure, this may not be everything I want, but I trust that your will be done. I trust that the leaders are seeking you. And I trust that even though it may not be like I want, or it may not be exactly what I would do, I'm doing my part. Now, God, I trust you with the rest. And even if something goes wrong or leaders have to pivot or whatever it is, you've still done your part. And then the burden or the responsibility shifts to those who are deciding what to do with the money and how they're doing the different things that they're doing. But our job is to step out and trust God in faith. And so that's a big thing when people say, well, I don't know. I'm afraid what they'll do or this or that. Look, do your research, but then at some point, you just got to step out. At some point, you just got to say, Lord, I trust you. I'm doing my part, God, do your part. That's one sort of thing. But here's maybe even a bigger thing, maybe even a deeper issue, is we have a control problem. We love to be in control. We do. I mean, I know very few people who do not have, maybe even no one, at least some aspect of wanting to have control of some part of their life. We all do it. And most of us want to control as much of our life as we can. But how much of our life do we really control? Very little, really. I think I've heard Tim Keller, talk about how we probably control about 5% total of our lives. And I feel like that's a fair assessment. We control so little of our lives, but we love to act like we can control it. Or we love to try the best we can to control our lives and our circumstances. So this control drive, this control thing that we have within us, a lot of times makes us a lot less generous than we should be. A lot of times, what it causes us to do is focus inwardly instead of outwardly, or on what our responsibilities are as a Christian. And how this applies to money is we think that the more money we have, the more we're able to control our lives. And while in one sense that is right, in another sense it's completely wrong. At least in a temporal aspect, sure, the more money you have, the more things you can do, the more in control you are. If you're a millionaire or multimillionaire, you have the ability to not work, or you have the ability to invest how you want, do what you want. Understood. Certainly having money and resource, when something comes up in your life, you're able to pivot easily or more easily. A big financial burden comes across, you could take care of it compared to people without money and resource. They can't. Something medical, you could do this. All that's understood. But if you're a Christian, we believe in a greater reality, right? We believe that we are just passing through, that we are sojourners here on earth to God's kingdom. And we believe of the reality that's talked about in Scripture. And so, when you believe in that reality, if you're a part of God's kingdom, what that means in a very real way is that our priorities have to shift. But we also realize through Scripture, not only do we control very little of our lives, but why would we want to control our lives when we can hand control over to the one who controls all things, the God of the universe, right? That's the person we should all want in control. So a big part of that is following His will, His way, and those are steps of faith. That's us trusting Him and handing over our lives in a very real way to Him, saying, God, I will follow your will and your way. It may be countercultural. It may not be the best that I could reason out, but I'm going to take you at your word. I'm going to step out here. I'm going to trust you with the results. Whether the result comes out good or bad or what I think it should be or not, that's not what I'm going to worry about. Because God calls us to be faithful, not successful. God calls us to trust Him and not worry about the results because He's got us. And so when we're talking about money and finances, this is another big part. Yes, we want to control our lives. It's this our natural thing. And so part of that is we do want to save up. I'm saving up. I have a savings account. I have a retirement account. I have all these different things. But I also have to look in my heart and say, am I still being generous? Yes, being generous or more generous in these different ways, whether it be with the church or other areas, that might cause me not to be able to save as much. That might cause me not to be able to hit my contributions to my retirement as early as I would like to then move that money around to other investments or things of that nature. Sure, that might be the reality, but I've got to trust God and realize that if He's in control, well, He's always in control, but if I let Him control more and more of my life, that is a better place to be than anything that I could control in my own strength. So that's a big reality for us as Christians, especially as we're talking about money. We want to control. We want to control our lives, our circumstances. We want to be able to take the vacations when we want, have the nice things. And look, I am as guilty as anyone. I don't care that I'm a pastor and been in ministry for a while. I am as guilty as anyone. I certainly like things. My kind of niche is I love technology, I love travel, love all that sort of stuff. So I'm guilty. Let me be the first to say that I look at my finances, and of course, as I said, I'm saving. I'm trying to be wise by saving. Retirement, I have my investments, but I've been pushing myself at least annually, but from time to time saying, how much more can I give? What do I need to move around to push my generosity up beyond my tithe, beyond all these different measures? Because if I truly believe God is who He says He is, and He will do what He says He's going to do, then all this anyway is His, right? This is such an important part when it comes to money and our resource, especially, I don't have time to preach a sermon here, but when you go back to Israel, what would happen was people would get their land back after a while, and a big part of that, even though they would sell it, they would get it back, and there was this renewal and all these different things, and a big part of that was everything is God's, and He's just giving it to us for a time. And so He can determine what He wants us to do with it. And Israel had some laws with that. And then it comes back to what Jesus talked about. Why would I store up treasure here on earth where moth and rust could destroy it? Instead of storing up treasure in heaven, right? Or ultimately, whenever I meet Him on the new heavens, new earth, whatever that looks like, but store up treasures in heaven where moth and rust cannot destroy, where thieves cannot break in and steal. This is the reality. Am I willing to take God at His word? Am I willing to take that step of faith and be more generous? Because you could see from the statistics, a lot of us are not there when it comes to Christianity. Even though, again, I would be hard-pressed, and I think anyone would be hard-pressed to find any way to get around that we should be generous people. We should be caring for the poor and the disenfranchised. We should be caring more for those who are different than us, who need help in different ways. That, it just seems undeniable in so many ways, yet we're just not there. And I think you see two big aspects of that. We're worried, where's the money going to go, or this isn't how I want it to go there. Or the big one is we want to control our lives. We want to be ready for those things. And that's fine in a lot of ways, but we've got to be able to push ourselves. We've got to be able to say, look, God's word is true. I believe this about God. All right. So that means I need to be generous with my time, with my words, all that sort of stuff, but also my resource, also my finance. So how can I figure out ways to be more generous? Where can I cut back? Where can I be less like the world and more like God? Because if we all did that, we wouldn't see what we're seeing with these statistics. We wouldn't see such need, I believe, in different areas. If the church was just more generous, if Christians were more generous in that. And this gets into maybe another episode about what the church should be doing with its money. But again, our job is to step out and trust God, to give, knowing that, God, I'm doing my part. And I'm turning it over to you. You handle it, God, right? And that big part of, look, I'm giving up control more and more. Maybe it's small steps. We could all take small steps, but if we take many small steps, they make a big difference, right? So that's what I have to say about all money. Came across the article. The statistics are always jarring, especially, like I said, during the Great Depression. You had people giving 3.3% were giving of their income. Rather, 2.5% of Christians today. We're richer now than ever before. We have more resource now than ever before. We're in such a better place now than ever before. And we're less generous, which says a lot about our human hearts and our culture in a lot of ways. But with that being said, hey, thanks for spending the time. As always, 3515, and I'll catch you again next time.